Here's a parable that I often use to explain the tension between the hard and soft virtues. There were once two friends who grew up together. They lived in the same neighbourhood, knew each other from their very earliest years, and for as long as they could remember, they had always done everything as a pair. When it was time to leave school, they even went to the same university and shared an apartment. One studied law and the other studied business. It was only after graduation that for the first time in their lives they were forced to part ways, as their careers took them in very different directions. The man who had studied law became a judge in his hometown, while the friend who had studied business took a job in a faraway city. Initially they kept in touch, but as the years passed and the concerns of life took over, they lost contact completely. Many years later, the businessman's life collapsed when he lost his job. His wife subsequently left him, taking their children with her, and this led him into a downward spiral of alcoholism and drug abuse. He wandered the country as a vagrant, and before long he was dabbling in serious crime to fund his habit. And then, at his lowest ebb, he murdered an innocent person for money. The police caught him and he was taken to stand trial before a judge. But when he entered the courtroom and looked up, he was shocked to discover that this was no ordinary judge overseeing his case. This was his long-lost friend. As the memories flooded back of their innocent childhood days together, it was like he woke up from a stupor and suddenly saw himself for what he'd really become. He never felt so ashamed. He stood in the dock now as nothing more than a wicked criminal, guilty of the worst kind of crime. He could barely lift his head to look his old friend, the judge, in the eye. To add to the drama, his victim's family were watching from the gallery above him. They sat in anticipation, expecting that justice would be enacted and the criminal would be sentenced to the full extent of the law, which in this city was the death penalty. The judge, for his part, was now facing a huge dilemma. On the one hand, his friend was undoubtedly guilty. There were witnesses and he'd admitted it with his own lips. There was no doubt that the judge had to pass the sentence. Indeed, if he didn't convict his friend of the crime, then justice would not be served. He would be a corrupt judge if he let his friend go. A good judge, a righteous judge, has to make sure that wickedness is punished. However, that didn't change the fact that the criminal in the dock was still his friend. He didn't want to condemn his friend to death because he loved him. Do you see the problem here then? Justice demands that he must convict this man because he's a murderer, but love tells him that he can't because he's his friend. So what does he do? Does he prioritise justice or love? To prioritise justice is too hard. It means the execution of his friend, but to prioritise love is too soft. That would be corrupt. This man's a murderer. You see, this parable reveals why people often believe that the two virtue sets are incompatible with each other. Because whenever a moral dilemma presents itself like this, the hard and soft virtues always demand completely different outcomes. The good judge has to ask himself, is there a way to satisfy both virtue sets at the same time? Remember, no one can truly be called good until they demonstrate a respect for both sides. There is a way, and this is how he does it. Firstly, he passes the guilty verdict so that justice is served. The full price for the crime will be paid by death. The hard virtues are now satisfied. But here's the twist. Instead of letting his wicked friend suffer the punishment that he deserves, the judge gets up from his chair, takes off his robes, comes down from his lofty position of power, and comes over to speak to his friend, saying, "Look, the law demands that a life be given for a life, but I can't let you take this punishment upon yourself because you are my friend. Therefore, I'm going to hand myself over to the executioner to die in your place. With my death, I am going to buy your freedom. Now, promise me that as you go free from here, you will honour this gift and that you will never break the law again." With that, the innocent judge leaves the room and hands himself over to be voluntarily executed in the place of his guilty friend. The soft virtues have now been satisfied too. Now, it's easy to feel outraged at this story. The guilty scumbag walks free and the innocent judge dies in his place? That's so unfair. Exactly. But remember, this is exactly what Jesus was doing when he went to the cross to die on our behalf. We are the guilty scumbag in the story. We are the sinners. Every single one of us has lied, stolen, lusted, blasphemed, and done immoral things throughout our lives. There's no point denying this. We know it's true. As the Bible says, everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. Therefore, we are all deserving of death. God in his perfect justice must destroy all evil. His perfect goodness means that he cannot excuse us. He has to pass the sentence of guilt. And yet that is only half the story, because the cross doesn't only tell us that God is just, it also tells us that God is loving, so loving that he came down from his lofty position to earth to take that punishment that we deserve upon himself, to die in our place so that we can go free. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends, Jesus said, and that's exactly what he did. This is the absolute genius of the cross then, that it satisfies the seemingly contradictory demands of both the hard and soft virtues simultaneously. They are held in counterbalance with each other. Justice and kindness, holiness and mercy, righteousness and grace is all being demonstrated in this picture. And if we add it to our visual, we get something like this. The cross of Christ is quite simply the central ground where all virtue meets. Whenever we're faced with a moral dilemma in life then, and we aren't sure about the right course of action, we can always get something approximating the right answer by picturing the cross and then remembering to find the solution that best combines both virtue sets. Of course, that isn't so easy for us flawed humans. The problem is that we all have these internal biases that give us a natural affinity for either the hard or soft virtues. And so we tend to find ourselves subconsciously gravitating towards the left or the right of the cross. We're easily imbalanced. C.S. Lewis wrote, "The devil always sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites. He relies on your extra dislike of one to draw you gradually into the opposite one. But do not let us be fooled. We have to keep our eyes on the goal and go straight through between both errors. We have no other concern than that with either of them." It's easier said than done though. Those who have a natural affinity for the soft virtues on the left are what we would call liberals today. Meanwhile, those who have a natural affinity for the hard virtues on the right are what we call conservatives. And because soft liberal values and hard conservative values always seem to be in conflict with one another, demanding completely different outcomes for moral dilemmas, it is common for both sides to develop a disregard or even a hatred for the other side. Using our courtroom parable, the liberal would have chosen to let the wicked friend walk free without hesitation in the name of love, while the conservative would have sent him to the death chamber with no questions asked in the name of justice. And then both liberals and conservatives would have bickered with each other about who had done the best thing. But in reality, of course, neither would have done the best thing in a universal sense. The best thing was to do what God did at Calvary, which is to hold both virtue sets in tension with each other.